Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the nature of American empire under President Trump with investigative journalist Allan Nairn.
Whether it's a Kissinger-style doctrine or whether it's an Obama-style doctrine, doesn't matter that much. What matters is, are you a murderer or not? Are you an aggressor or not? And it's still the same as before.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Terror, intimidation, and violence are the glue that holds empire together. Aerial bombardment, drone and missile attacks, artillery and mortar strikes, targeted assassinations, massacres, the detention of tens of thousands, death squad killings, torture, wholesale surveillance, extraordinary renditions, curfews, propaganda, a loss of civil liberties, and pliant political puppets are the grist of our wars and proxy wars. Countries we seek to dominate, from Indonesia and Guatemala to Iraq and Afghanistan, are intimately familiar with these brutal mechanisms of control. But the reality of empire rarely reaches the American public. The few atrocities that come to light are dismissed as isolated aberrations. The public is assured that what has been uncovered will be investigated and will not take place again. The goals of empire, we are told by a subservient media and our ruling elites, are virtuous and noble. And the vast killing machine grinds forward, feeding, as it has always done, the swollen bank accounts of defense contractors and corporations that exploit natural resources and cheap labor around the globe. It is doubtful a Trump administration will be able to shift the focus or bellicosity of the American empire. RT correspondent Anya Parampel looks at the vast reach of the American military.
During his inaugural address, President Donald Trump declared for too long the commander-in-chief has allowed for the, quote, sad depletion of the U.S. military. However, the U.S. military's global presence drastically expanded under the watch of Barack Obama. Take, for example, the continent of Africa. In 2008, the Obama administration made former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's dream of establishing a permanent Africa-centric wing of the military a reality, with the creation of AFRICOM. While the U.S. only formally admits to having one base on the continent in Djibouti, investigative journalist Nick Turse has documented military outposts, port facilities, and other cooperative areas in dozens of other locations. While Obama moved us away from traditional warfare, he expanded the use of CIA assassin drones to multiple countries, thanks to this stronghold in Africa. Obama also transformed the military so it relies heavily on special ops forces rather than regular troops. In 2009, these elite fighters were active in about 60 countries. By 2016, they'd been deployed to 138 countries, according to U.S. Special Operations Command. In other words, Obama extended U.S. Special Operations to 75% of the globe. Obama expanded the authorization for the use of military force passed by Congress in 2001 to include military actions against al-Shabaab and the self-proclaimed Islamic State, two groups which did not even exist at its inception. All of this means Donald Trump takes power with unprecedented levels of power concentrated in the executive, and a vast military more secretive than ever.
Thank you, Anya. There are very few journalists who have covered empire with more courage, tenacity, and integrity than Allan Nairn. For more than 3 decades, he has reported from Central America, East Timor, Palestine, South Africa, Haiti, and Indonesia, where Indonesian soldiers fractured his skull and arrested him for his reporting of the massacres in East Timor. He exposed U.S. complicity with death squads and paramilitary organizations carrying out murderous rampages in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Haiti. He has written for numerous publications, including The Nation, and won numerous awards, including the George Polk Award for Journalism in Magazine Reporting. Allan, thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be with you.
Let's talk about the nature of empire, which President Trump has inherited, and you've covered for many years. How does it function? How does it come to its decisions, and what are the forces that direct it?
Well, I don't like the word empire. I think the U.S. role in the world is substantially different from, say, the British Empire, others we think of. But I think the key fact is that the U.S. today has power in almost all countries in the world. They are willing to kill civilians.
Are you talking about military power?
Total power. The different kinds of power, military, economic, political. They're willing to kill civilians, and they're willing to commit aggression. Once you get past those 2 points, the other distinctions don't matter as much. You know, there's a lot of talk about whether Trump will be a departure from the neocon foreign policy. It doesn't really matter in a sense. What matters is if you're willing to kill civilians and willing to commit aggression. And Trump clearly is. There's a network of corporate power around the world. It used to be almost entirely U.S. corporations. That's no longer so much the case. The corporations are becoming increasingly multinational, and you have powerful state corporations coming out of places like China and Russia, even Brazil. And with Trump, I think you see the possibility, really for the first time ever, of a new world order that involves an even closer than before merger between the corporation and the state. And even possibly a certain kind of coming together among Moscow, Washington, and Beijing, together with the Fortune 500, essentially an alliance of the strong against the weak, which has the potential to devastate the world even more than the previous eras have, especially when it comes to things like extinction, pulling off all constraints on climate change, pulling off all constraints on corporate exploitation, destroying democratic institutions, crushing labor, closing open media channels and channels of dissent. If Trump and the American Republicans have their way, I think there could be a convergence toward a kind of authoritarian state capitalism on which the three big powers and the world's corporations more or less agree.
And yet you have powerful forces in both the Republican and Democratic parties who are extremely antagonistic towards Russia with the expansion of NATO and fairly antagonistic towards China. How does Trump overcome those forces which are bipartisan?
Well, I think that kind of united world order of states and corporations is probably a vision that some people like Trump, like General Flynn and others have. It'll be very hard to pull off. I think there are too many moving parts to actually pull it off, but they'll be moving in that direction. You know, I think the relationship between Trump and, say, Russia, who knows which way it'll go. He has a very personal style of rule. If somebody in Russia makes a bad remark about him, you know, he may reverse his policy. In terms of Trump and Russia, I think the most relevant points are, I think he may seek to emulate Russia in two respects. One, completely removing any constraints that exist on military action against civilians. General Mattis, the new defense secretary, when he was when he was a commander in Iraq in '04, there was a village on the Iraq-Syria border where they bombed a wedding party, killed 42 people, and afterward, Mattis said, "Oh yeah, I deliberated on that one for about 30 seconds before I ordered them to go in." Now, in a rational, just system, Mattis would have had to stand trial for that. Instead, he ended up being invited to speak at both the Republican and the Democratic conventions. He was the main guy who was floated by the anti-Trump Republican establishment as their possible third-party candidate, and now he is Trump's defense secretary. Flynn, the new national security advisor, bitterly attacked Obama because in his view, Obama wasn't doing enough assassinations. He wasn't doing enough drone assassinations. And in that respect, Trump and the radical right-wing oligarchic Republicans are somewhat emulating the Russian model. You know, in September and October, by one estimate from Human Rights Watch, the Russian and Syrian forces killed, I think it was 447 civilians in East Aleppo.
Right. They did what we did in Fallujah.
With their bombings. Well, but the thing is, if you look at the Russian doctrine versus the U.S. doctrine, the Russian doctrine is even more unconstrained in terms of how many civilians you can kill. And already in the final months of the Obama administration, the U.S. Pentagon loosened some of the restraints that existed in terms of choosing targets. And the Trump people have made clear they want to pull those restraints off entirely. And then on a second level, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a mass privatization of public assets. You had public assets essentially being given to oligarchs, and that's basically the economic vision of the Trump administration.
That's what's happened here.
For the U.S.
And I want to talk about the power of the arms industry to drive policy decisions, especially with the expansion of NATO and these endless wars that are taking place in Afghanistan and Iraq with kind of no end in sight. You know, how much of this do you think is profit-driven as opposed to actually a rational policy decision?
I don't think particular decisions about whether to invade a particular country, they usually are not driven by arms. What is driven by the arms industry is the imperative to maintain a massive military establishment, because that's the government welfare on which the arms industry subsists.
But even you would have to admit that, for instance, with the call to invade Libya, you had all these retired generals who were working for Raytheon and companies that profited off of the attack on Libya on their calling for expansion of these wars and regime change. And they personally profited, and the corporations they worked for profited from it.
Oh, sure. But it's a general push. What they push for is a massive military establishment, unlimited capabilities, the word they use, which essentially means ability to kill. And once you establish that, it has to be kept busy. There's a bureaucratic imperative to stay active, to stay busy. I think there was one exception to that rule where there was a very direct industrial imperative, and that was the former Yugoslavia, where you know, the push to intervene in Kosovo, the bombing of Serbia, that was being directly argued for. The Wall Street Journal had a piece where they directly said this, that it had to be done in order to maintain NATO credibility, in order to convince the members and the candidate members to devote a sufficiently large share of their national budget to military spending. But in most cases, I don't think it's a specific factor, but they call for the maintenance and the expansion of this bureaucracy of death. And Trump has made clear that he wants to massively expand the defense industry. And right now in Congress, they're talking about lifting the sequester cap on military spending, but maintaining it on domestic spending. And Mulvaney, the new OMB chief, is going to be looking to massively slash domestic spending so they can fund that military spending.
We'll get back to that. Thanks, Allan. And join me after the break with journalist Allan Nairn. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation with journalist Allan Nairn. So let's go back to where we were before. The point that you made about expansion of military spending and reduction of domestic spending, which has already been signaled by the Trump administration. What is that? What's happening here? What is the military establishment doing? What are the arms contractors doing? What are we undergoing?
Well, as a result of the election, the U.S. has just experienced a rightist revolution. Some people may not realize it yet, but this is a truly revolutionary moment. And I think we're at the early phase of a time of social upheaval in the United States. This is a consequence of the collapse of the American working class and middle class. And it could have broken either way in this election.
And a collapse of liberal institutions that once took their interests into account.
Yeah. The Democrats sold out the working class. They let the Republicans, who were openly the party of the rich, run roughshod over working people. And it could have broken either way in this election. Sanders could have won, in which case there would be a substantial turn to the left. But now we have rightist revolution. I mean, Trump himself is a neo-fascist in many aspects of his thought. He's a white supremacist. And he represents kind of the crudest criminal elements of the American oligarchy. But in a way, he isn't even the most significant part of the new government. It's the Republican Party. The Republican Party now is so radically to the right that I think you have to go back to the Civil War era to find an analogy in terms of an American political party that is this revolutionary. They're looking to dismantle 100 years of progress. In the case of Sessions, the Attorney General, he clearly regrets the outcome of the Civil War.
Right.
He openly opposes the gains of the civil rights uprising, and they have been preparing for this since 1980. You know, the Powell memorandum written by
Powell, 1971.
Yes,
right.
who was a corporate lawyer and who wrote a brilliant strategy memo responding to the gains that had been made by labor
right.
and the environmental movement and the consumer movement in the 60s and 70s. And he said, we, the rich, have to do a counter-mobilization. And they did it. And they've been preparing for this for decades.
Yeah.
And they have a blueprint laid out. And they are going, you have now people like, Price at Health, the EPA, the Labor Department, in control of Trump appointees who are looking to dismantle the work of those departments, and they're going to try to put unrestricted power for unleash all constraints that exist on the oligarchs.
For corporations.
Well, that's what they're seeking. Now, with Trump, though, there is a twist. Some people say Trump is a populist. I think that's nonsense. Trump is an oligarch who can get elected. And he did it by running to the left on trade
right.
And on neocon wars. Now, he was lying on both issues, but he saw that the American electorate had moved to the left on those issues.
Right.
Clinton and the Democrats did not see that. Trump won. He's now gotten them through the door. He's gotten them into power. And part of Trump's style is to bash, again, it's kind of reminiscent of his friend Putin in Russia, and that is to bash individual rich people who are rivals, but strengthen the rich as a class and dismantle democratic institutions. So Trump will have running feuds with various corporate chiefs over closing plants and whatever, but there will be a massive transfer of wealth to corporations and individual rich people, and he'll try to frame it as a fight for the working class against the rich.
Does this mean an expansion of well, I know you don't like the word empire, although I think you would agree that it does resemble the Roman Empire in the sense of creating clients, which is what Rome did very well. But nevertheless, expansion of American militarism, is this what you expect, and
yes.
What will that mean?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, doesn't that inevitably lead to conflicts?
Oh, yeah. It will lead to more conflicts. There are several levels to it. One, they're going to try to lift all constraints on the Pentagon and the CIA and their overseas operations. And there are many constraints. One thing many people, including many progressives, don't appreciate is that decades of work by people from peace movements, from human rights movements, have succeeded in putting in many constraints on overseas operations of the U.S. There are things like the Harkin Amendment, the Leahy Amendment. There are dozens and dozens of constraints like that, which have saved many, many thousands of lives in terms of how American power operates overseas. They're going to look to erase all those. They're going to look to be completely unconstrained in their bombing. And Trump says he rejects the doctrine of invading countries to build nations, but he embraces the doctrine of invading countries to steal resources. And with someone like Tillerson of Exxon at State, he could get some support for that. That becomes especially ominous for countries like Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserve. But I think the doctrine, whether it's a Kissinger-style doctrine or whether it's an Obama-style doctrine, doesn't matter that much. What matters is, are you a murderer or not? Are you an aggressor or not? And it's still the same as before in that sense. The U.S. is still ready to commit murder of civilians and aggression if it has the whim to do it, or if it sees it to be in its deeper interests. And the amount of invasions that take place, I think, actually depends on circumstances as they develop. I don't think that's a predetermined thing. But what we clearly see is a changing of the rules for completely unconstrained U.S. power overseas.
Obama changed the rules. I mean, yes. In terms of the right to assassinate American citizens, militarized drones being used in countries where we have never declared war against. The Obama expanded.
And the Trump people bitterly attack Obama for not going far enough.
Right.
That's the point of Flynn. That's the point of Mattis. That's the point of Pompeo, the new CIA chief. These people viciously assail Obama for not murdering enough civilians with his drone strikes.
But doesn't that inevitably create friction if you talk about the three major global players, China, Russia, the United States? Don't you begin to bump up against what they consider to be their interests? And doesn't that ratchet up the possibility of global conflict?
Potentially, but you can't predict that.
Right,
I mean, who knows? It does ratchet up that possibility. One thing that is much more likely, though, is that those that are not the great powers, weaker, poorer countries, will be in more danger now. For example, Trump and his people are open supporters of authoritarian death squad leaders. Duterte in the Philippines, al-Sisi in Egypt, figures like that. For years, the U.S. has supported figures like that, but because of the success of popular movements since the 60s in putting some constraints on U.S. policy and to some extent shifting public opinion marginally against overseas murder, they've had to be hypocritical about it. They've had to say, well, we support democracy overseas. We don't like dictators, even while they're supporting dictators. Now with Trump, you have people who are open exponents of dictatorship, of death squads, and that means even more support for these figures.
So what about Israel?
Well, with his ambassador to Israel, Trump has signaled that he's embracing the most radical elements in Israeli
so did Obama.
in Israeli politics. But he goes well beyond Obama, because the kind of people that Trump is aligning with in Israeli politics are those who are talking about things like mass expulsion of the Palestinians.
Obama didn't like Netanyahu. All indications are that he couldn't stand Netanyahu, and yet he signed this massive arms deal with Israel. In 8 years, they did nothing to attempt in a meaningful way to halt settlement expansion or the massacre of Palestinians in these bombing campaigns of Gaza.
And the Trump people assail him for not going far enough. I think it's possible that in Palestine, this may trigger a counter-reaction, because it seems to me that the only real hope for the Palestinians is a new intifada on the lines of the first one, a peaceful intifada. And I was there in '88 during the first intifada.
I was there.
And you could see it succeeding as it was happening. Yeah. You could see the Israeli political defenses just crumbling in the face of these kids with stones. Unfortunately, it got hijacked and sidetracked, and in the end, it was a failure. But something like that, again, does have the potential to roll back the Israeli occupation to a certain extent. And maybe Trump will provoke that, but that's not his aim. I mean, he is lining up with the people who want to kill and massacre and crush the Palestinians even more thoroughly than the Netanyahu people.
What is this going to mean domestically? Just to close here.
Well, I think the domestic impact of Trump will be even larger than the foreign impact, because they're looking to give corporations an unlimited license to pollute, to break unions, to cheat consumers, to cheat on their taxes to the extent they have to pay taxes. They're telling rich people, don't worry about taxes on your inheritance, don't worry about taxes on your property, just hand it down to your kids who don't work. They're looking to boost government subsidies to the rich and to corporations. And I wouldn't be surprised to see an increase in domestic repression. The Black Lives Matter movement, BLM was denounced as terrorist at the Republican convention. They could be targeted. The people, the Native Americans who were resisting the Dakota pipeline, people like that could be targeted.
Well, they were targeted already. I mean, rubber bullets.
But again, even more extensively.
Right.
Rubber bullets are one thing. Real bullets are another. Now they have these bogus local charges they're bringing against people. You could have federal charges starting to be brought against protesters of this kind under a Trump Justice Department. I think activists in the United States should start studying how activists in overseas repressive regimes work and start learning some lessons from that, because we're entering an era where the constraints are being lifted from the rich and from those both, and from American powers who operate both internationally and domestically, who believe in killing. And it's a very dangerous time, but it's also potentially a time of opportunity, because I think the key thing to remember is this could have broken the other way. The U.S. could now have been swinging to the left if Bernie Sanders maybe had started his campaign 2 months earlier. The basic long-term direction of the U.S. in this moment is probably to the left, because when you have a collapse of the middle class and working class, that's where it would tend to pull you. But at this moment, the right has successfully staged a political revolution, and they're going to be looking to get everything they can. They're going to try to dismantle 100 years of progress in the first 100 days.
Great. Thank you, Allan. That was journalist Allan Nairn. The failed states we created in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, a direct result of globalization, have their counterparts in Detroit, St. Louis, Oakland, Memphis, Baltimore, Atlanta, Milwaukee, and the south side of Chicago. They are our versions of Mogadishu, complete with lawlessness, senseless killings, armed gangs, widespread hunger, fear, a population retreating into the numbing embrace of opiates, crippling poverty, dysfunctional state institutions, and the growth of private security companies that protect the elites, as well as indiscriminate police violence that creates reigns of terror aimed at the poor. The more the global corporate forces extract from us in the name of austerity and the maximization of profits to feed the excess of empire, the more parts of the United States will descend into domestic versions of the failed states overseas. These forces were beyond the control of Barack Obama, and they will be beyond the control of Donald Trump. They are the unassailable engines driving a dying empire over a cliff. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. See you next week.